Moving on to total war. Now, this is basically a term that implies that far more than the military personnel are involved in a war effort. So mass civilian populations are also directly involved in the course of war, in total war. All right? So what we're going to see throughout Europe, no matter which alliance one belongs to, there is at first a general enthusiasm for the war. And a lot of that is due to nationalism. Okay, what you're going to see that might be surprising is that even socialists are supporting the war effort, at least for a time. Another thing that certainly comprises total war is that there are mass conscription efforts on behalf of each country. Conscription, remember, means draft, so you're going to have a really large amount of people directly involved in the military. You're also going to see civilian casualties, all right? We already discussed how the technological innovations like planes and zeppelins are going to allow bombing of major population centers. So a really good example of that would be how the Germans actually are bombing London with zeppelins. And here's a memorial to commemorate a zeppelin that bombed London in 1915. You're also going to see the use of blockades is also going to involve total war because it's literally going to starve populations, and the British blockade against Germany is the best example of that. You're also going to see a lot of propaganda that's produced to generate support for the war effort among one's country. The news in general was censored, right? So you're not going to see opposition to the war be published very frequently, if at all. All right. This propaganda is also going to sort of vigorously defend the men on the front lines that are fighting for one's country, and it's going to try to dehumanize the enemy, which you can clearly see here, right? And we'll discuss this again in just a moment. All right. Now, some people argue, at least in Germany, that another thing that the propaganda was trying to do was to get Germans against the Socialist Party, right? Because at first the Socialist Party may not have been seen as likely to support the war effort, and of course the government itself felt challenged by the socialists. All right, so some people thought that this propaganda was not only supporting the war effort, but also trying to, kind of slow down the growth of the Socialist Democratic Party. However, in 1914, what you're going to see is something called a Burgfrieden, which is state of truce. All right, so basically what you're going to see is that the socialists actually say, you know what, we're going to support this war because we feel like it's time to establish peace with the Kaiser. You see this also happening when Britain is coming behind the support of Irish independence during the war as well. And again, returning to this poster in particular, you see a lot of racial themes in propaganda. The idea that this German brute, as they say, is portrayed as, sort of a primordial figure, that he is very dark, and he's ultimately committing some sort of crime, potentially rape, against this allied woman. He's German because culture is written here. Also, this is an American advertisement, so Germany is clearly one of their major enemies. Okay, economic production also is going to center around the war effort. All right, you're going to see that all these laissez-faire economies that we're developing in the midst of industrialization are going to start to shift more towards planned economies. And that way, each country can have much more control over determining how much is produced, what it is produced for, where it is going, and so on, to make sure that there's always enough supply to keep the military going. So you're going to see that countries really are no longer relying on foreign trade when the war begins. They're going to try to be very self-sufficient. Governments, again, are deciding what's produced and consumed. You're going to see rationing take place more and more. All right, so, just trying to restrict the amount of things that are consumed by the general population. Rationing was also seen as a patriotic effort. Okay, this is, the idea, if you save bread or save wheat, you will actually help the general population. Germany in particular, how it changes its economy to help support the war. You're going to see it create something called the Raw War Materials Board, which is going to establish plans to ration a variety of raw materials. It's also going to start introducing substitute products. So, for example, instead of using rubber, they're going to create a synthetic rubber so they don't have to worry about depleting the natural resources. They're also going to introduce a recycling program, which is very innovative for its day. Germany is also going to pass something called the Auxiliary Service Law in 1916, which makes it so that all men had to work in jobs that were considered critical for the war effort. All right, so you already saw a lot of women working in the war effort, but it's going to increase that as well. Britain, you're also going to see it shaping its economy significantly around the war effort. At first, they don't mobilize quite as quickly as Germany, and part of that is because when the U.S. remained neutral at the beginning, they were assisting Britain by giving them supplies. However, as the war continued and stalemate ensued, Britain found itself experiencing a shortage of weapons, of shells in particular. So what you're going to see is, because of that shortage, Britain is going to establish something called the Ministry of Munitions. All right, what this is going to do is it's going to make it so that private industries are also going to be working for the war effort. So sort of nationalization of industry. By the time 1916 occurs, Britain is more or less in a planned economy as well. By the time David Lloyd George becomes prime minister, so you're going to see a large number of factories be nationalized. Imports are going to be controlled by the state, and rationing is going to be strict. All right, just in general, war production is going to be skyrocketing around this point. Another thing that's going to be changing during the wartime economically significantly is that you're going to see an increased number of women enter the labor force. All right, actually in Russia, you're going to see this more than anywhere else. 43% of the labor force in Russia is female. In addition to that, you're going to see significantly changing attitudes towards women's place in society. Many countries, very shortly after the war ends, grant women full voting rights for the first time. Okay, so that's a huge change. You're also going to see general fashion and behavior among women change, especially when you get closer into the 20s. When you think of the typical 20s female figure, you think potentially of wearing your hair short, maybe dressing in a slightly more provocative style, covering up less. Also, women started to smoke in public, which was a way that they could kind of exhibit equal behavior to men. All right. There was also pressure during the war for women to receive more equal pay to their male counterparts, but this was short-lived and went away after the war was over. You're also going to see labor unions start to back down and support the war. Okay, this is because since there's so much demand for labor, unions and workers themselves are going to experience an improved status. All right, they're going to get paid relatively well. They're going to have relatively good working conditions. So there's less of a need for workers to organize, and there's less of a need for them to strike. So many laborers are going to decide to vote against striking to support the war effort. Labor unions also are going to cooperate with governments so that they can have a better role in policy making, and it also just continues to help labor unions have a strong status with the government so that there will be less anti-labor efforts from the government in the future. These are all signs of labor union members who are actually supporting the war. You're also going to see an increased social status, or I guess another way of saying it is that the gap between the rich and the poor is going to be a little bit less apparent during the war. Partly this is because there's so many more jobs available. You're going to see, because of better working conditions, there will be less people after the war ends living in severe poverty. This is just a general advertisement, seeking employment, so many, many more jobs. As far as financing the war is concerned, many people got involved, regardless if they were not actually enlisting in the services. They could also support the war effort by buying what were called war bonds. All right, so this is an advertisement explaining that ultimately, this is a way to finance the war effort, express one's patriotism without directly fighting. So a bond, is something that immediately pays the government. You will eventually earn back that money with interest, right? But it immediately helps give the government significant aid towards the war effort. You're also going to see in general governments become more and more centralized during the First World War. In France, the Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau becomes a really active supporter of total war. He wants to get everyone in France involved behind the war effort. And when any talks come up about surrendering to Germany, Georges Clemenceau vehemently refuses to do so. Many historians argue that his control over the government during the war was a quasi-dictatorship. Right? Germany is essentially going to establish a totalitarian regime during the war, again, by completely controlling the economy. And some of this also is because Germany finds itself in such a desperate situation as the war continues that they have to make their government more repressive. People were literally starving as a result of the Allied blockade, and so the government found it had to tighten its grasp over the population to prevent revolts and mutinies and so on. Britain also is going to become more centralized because its economy is going to become more controlled, less laissez-faire. Alright, there are many people though who do not enjoy the idea of total war. We may remember from chapter 25 that this was the same time that Ireland was seeking independence. The independence movement was underway before the war started, however, it sort of takes the sidelines during the war. Now, many Irish nationalists were unhappy with this, so they staged the Easter Rebellion in 1916. They're really tired of the First World War. They want their independence movement to receive more attention from the British government. However, this is squashed by the British military in 1916. You will, of course, later see that the Irish will gain their independence following the war. There's going to be some protest against the war within German borders. All right, Karl Liebknecht in particular leads many anti-government revolts in 1816. One of the major reasons why people become increasingly unhappy with the government and the war effort in Germany is because many people are starving as a result of the blockade. Right? And they're also not doing well on either front as the war continues, both west and east. The Allies are closing in on them. All right. The government, however, was sort of reluctant to give in because the Triple Entente did not seem to be willing to grant favorable peace terms to the Central Powers. So what you're going to see is as the war goes on, people who initially supported the war in Germany are going to go back against it. Socialists are going to abandon their war support and start voting. If they're in the Reichstag, they're going to start voting against war credits. People are going to resume, their labor unions are going to go back to striking. There's a little bit of a pause in this anti-war effort when Russia enters into its separate peace with Germany with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. But ultimately, this is just going to be temporary. There are going to be mutinies in Italy as well, and you're also going to see a lot of political disfaction in Austria. So, it doesn't really matter which side you are on. Both sides become increasingly war-weary as time goes on. And this is not at all surprising since the war was expected to be so short, but continued for years. So basically, every example on this slide is showing us that the length and the drawn-out nature of the war is going to make it so that that nationalism that caused so many people to be okay with total war at the beginning is going to fade. And more people are going to be dissatisfied with the government, and they're going to respond by taking action, moving together to organize against the government. These movements almost exclusively come from the left, however, which is important to acknowledge. Okay, I've alluded towards Russia a few times, but I haven't really gotten into the details about what's happening there. So the next video segments are going to be discussing the Russian Revolution.